Hey, this is the chair guy. Several people were confused by my chord matrix video, so I'm going to try and clarify by going into a little more detail. All we're really trying to understand is what all chords are associated with any given key and be able to do bar chords up and down the fretboard, and of course it will also tell you what open chords you can use. So if you place a throne here on the low E string, whether you put it with the back of the throne on the low E string or the front of the throne on the low E string, it still works because all you need is this key right here. And if you know this key, you'll know how any throne is going to work on the fretboard. There are going to be 6 chords associated with a key. Technically there's 7, but we aren't usually going to use the chord based on this 7th note right here. So all we need to know is that these 3 notes of a throne are always going to be the roots of major chords, and these 3 notes the roots of minor chords, unless of course you're doing some kind of a substitution. So in this case, of course, we are using the key of G because that's the example I often use, but you could slide this throne up and down to be any other key as well. So where do we start? Well, let's start on this E right here because there actually would be a throne going off the fretboard if the fretboard went up that high. So this E right here, if we look at our key, is a minor chord. So we take an E minor chord shape, and there we have our E minor chord using an E minor chord shape. The red circles just indicate that those are roots, so we have 3 notes in the E minor chord shape, no matter where we place it up and down the fretboard. The next minor chord is going to be this A, because right here on the back of the chair, we see that this note and this note are both minor. So if we use the E minor chord shape, we know that we have an E minor chord at the top of the fretboard, we have an A minor chord here, and a B minor chord here. Then if we slide all the way down to this E, we actually have the exact same chord that we had here up at the nut, except that it's an octave higher because everything above the 12th fret is mirrored below the 12th fret. Now, technically, if we could slide this all the way down to the bottom of the fretboard, we would have another E minor chord, except that even if you have 24 frets, you're not going to have notes for that. But theoretically, that would work. So here we have our 3 minor chords, of course, repeated up and down the fretboard, going down the low E string, and then we will use the E major chord shape for all of the major chords. And the first one is going to be our G, because right here we see that on the back of the throne, the first note, the root G here is going to be a major chord. And of course, remember, this would be true whether we were playing in G or E minor, because these chords will work both for the major root and for its relative minor. So if we slide down to the back, or rather the front of this throne right here, then of course we know that these 2 are major. And so this C is going to be a C major, and this is going to be a D major. So these 3 chords are the 3 major chords associated with both G and E minor. And then of course we could slide down to this G right here, and we would have a chord that was exactly the same as this chord right here, except that it's an octave higher, and we could keep going down the fretboard because remember, everything mirrors. Now we move to the A string, and we use our A chord shapes. So our very first note, this A right here, we know that that is part of the throne. It's just like this A right here, except that it's the one starting on the A string, and we know that it's going to be minor. So we grab the A minor chord shape, and there we go. That is our first chord on the fretboard. We slide down to our B, because remember, both the A and the B are both minor. So we have A minor, B minor, just like we had on the A string, but now we have them on, on the E string, but now we have them on the A string. And then we can slide down to our E. And so the A, B, and E, we had them on the low E string, but we have them just in different places on the A string. We can keep sliding down. And of course, now we have the A again, and this A is going to be the same as the A up here, except it is going to be of a higher octave. slide down to the B, slide down to the E. The whole thing just keeps going. Then, of course, we have our major chords that are based on the A string. Now, the first note there is, of course, going to be this C. Remember, it's the front of the chair. So we place this A major chord shape here on the C, and now it's a C major. We go down to the D. We have a D major, because remember, that is a major chord. Then we need to get to that next G, so we need the back of a chair. So here's the back of the chair right here, and this is a G. Now, the reason we always use or rather we often use the A and E shapes is just because they are the simplest to do and they're very easy to jump between. So if we were to map all of those E major and E minor chord shapes onto the fretboard, in other words, everything beginning on the low E string, we would get this. And so this just represents all of these chords up and down the fretboard. And then with the A string, we get the same thing. We plot them up and down the fretboard. And this is where things get fun, because of course, if you lay these over each other, then you get all the E and E minor chord shapes and the A and A minor chord shapes, and they're right beside each other. So in other words, G major is right next to C major, A minor is right next to D major, B minor is right next to E, etc. So it's very easy to jump between them. And of course, if you know, for instance, what G major is, A minor, B minor in the open chords, then you can jump up and you can play them in the open chords as well. So hopefully this made sense. Please ask me any questions on Instagram. I will try to do a carousel of all of these diagrams as well.